letting you know what's coming down the pike. So on Wednesday, we have a Zoom session at 5 o'clock with Amanda Demmer, who's an assistant professor of history at Virginia Tech, with a wonderfully timely book about after Saigon's fall. And so unfortunately, it's timely for what we're thinking about nowadays, as we'll probably get into. But that's a great opportunity at 5 o'clock. And then we hope that everyone will be sending in their applications for the staff ride, for the Pearl Harbor staff ride.
I'm in.
Yes, your application is due on Wednesday at 11:59, so right before midnight. But that'll be over spring break, and we're going to study the obviously the road to war in the Pacific, and then the aftermath of Pearl Harbor. So it's a great opportunity. But I have been chasing Jane Harman now for a dozen years, trying to persuade her. And every year we say, next year in Jerusalem, next year in Durham, I'm going to get you down there. We always try, and but we could never get it to work until I cracked the code. If I hired Paige Rotunda from your staff, then she could make it happen. And so Paige made it happen. And for that reason, I'm just so glad that successfully bring you down here. So Congresswoman Harman is well respected in DC and national security circles as an influential voice. She's worked for several decades in serving a district from California on the Democratic side, but she was also consulted by Republicans, as we'll talk about in a moment. And then she went on to head the Wilson Center, which is a respected think tank. And if you want internships or jobs, talk to her about how that works in DC.
No, talk to Paige.
Yes, that's true. That's true. Great place to work. But she has, Jane, you have written an interestingly titled book, The Insanity Defense. And I want to begin by talking there, but first just welcome and thank you for coming.
Well, thank you, Peter. Before we begin, though, I'm delighted to be down here. I'm glad you caught me. It is wonderful to re-engage with Paige, who spent 4 perfect years at the Wilson Center, helping run our congressional program, which is quite successful. And oh, by the way, we also conduct classes there teaching Capitol Hill staff foreign policy, cybersecurity, and AI, which is something they don't learn at work, and they also don't know each other. It's been pretty amazing to see that. But I want to commend Paige. And at lunch, some of you were there. I had a conversation, or after lunch, with Bruce Jettleson, who has been at the Wilson Center twice and is coming back again in the spring. So he can't get enough of the place. I highly recommend it to all of you. I really do. And to you, Peter, I don't know when I met you, but I think it was in Aspen. I think we are both members of the Aspen security group, and I have been on it for 400 years. And I, by the way, just describe myself as a recovering lawyer, recovering politician, democratic centrist, and digital adapter, which makes me a dinosaur. I should be in a museum under glass. I now told you. But anyway, it's delightful to see you, Peter. You're just the most energetic, brightest, interesting guy, and a hallowed professor here. Everybody's raving about you. I just signed books, so I checked on you, and I'm really happy to be here.
Well, thank you. So I'm going to, after that gracious words, I'm going to come in with a high, hard, fast one, some chin music on this book. So I think you have 2 compelling arguments in this book. The first is that the national security establishment keeps making the same mistakes. The second is that you are a highly valued member of this national security establishment that keeps making the same mistakes. So it feels a little bit like Maoist self-criticism, and reconcile those 2 things, because of course they could both be true, but then why did you keep making mistakes? Why do people like us keep making mistakes?
Well, oh, now you've included yourself. So, yeah, why do we keep, well, that's my point. And by the way, the title, which is very catchy, was not my title. I was going to name this book something boring like "The War on Terror Has Not Made Us Safer," which I have come to believe. But my youngest daughter, I have 4 children, said, "Mother, that is the most boring title. The book should be Insanity Defense," and it's a play on words, but it's actually exactly what Peter just described, which is the story of how we haven't figured out a strategy since the Cold War ended. And those just happened, those 30 years just happened to overlap my time in elected politics and running the Wilson Center. It's not that I wasn't born before that. So, but we got some things right. I'll take full credit for those. And we got a few things wrong, and that was somebody else's fault. That's kind of my view.
So you say we didn't have a strategy. I want to push you on that. I think we had a strategy, and the strategy was we wanted to avoid another Cold War, that we wanted to avoid a hostile peer rival who could challenge us the way we might be facing today with China. And we did that for several decades, and now, of course, it's run its course. But there was a strategy. Doesn't mean it was perfect in every respect. But would you buy that there was this concern of, we just got out of the Cold War, we don't want to go back into that, and now we got to deal with the problems that remain?
Not really. Here's why. I think we won the Cold War. Russia lost the Cold War. And I think our assumption, certainly in the 90s, was we were the sole superpower, as Madeleine Albright called us, the indispensable nation. I never loved that phrase. I love her, but I think the indispensable partner would be a much more apt phrase and be more helpful. But anyway, in the 90s, we totally missed the rise of China. We totally missed, or substantially missed, the rise of terrorism. I was on something called the National Commission on Terrorism in the late 90s, and we predicted a major attack on US soil, as did 2 other groups. And nobody was really listening. And they were not listening, including in the early Bush 43 administration. I mean, I think the failure to get this right is over 4 administrations, 2 Democrats and 2 Republicans. So I'm not, I hope you don't hear me as partisan about this. But I think we missed all that. And I think there was hubris and arrogance, and we should have formulated a strategy then that would have kept us much safer. I'm not arguing that well, actually, I am. The more I think about this, the more I disagree, Peter, because one of the things we did at the end of the Cold War under Bush 41 was to cut our defense and intelligence procurement budgets. Because why did we need all that stuff? Because we were safe now. And when I was elected in 1992, this is one of the stories I tell about my getting things wrong, or well, whatever. I was elected in 1992. And in an aerospace dependent district in Southern California. And the cuts in these budgets meant the cuts in the rocket scientists who had won the Cold War. And I fought tooth and nail to retain jobs and to help the Defense Department, the aerospace base, transition to what we were calling dual use technologies, so they could build the same satellite bus, the same satellite frame, and stuff it either with defense software or with stuff that would help beam TV down to all of us, so we could become numbed to the problems of the world. But my point is, I fought to protect what we had, but not for the right reasons. I fought to protect it for very, special self-interest reasons to help my district. I'm not saying that's a bad reason, but I didn't have a strategy either, is my point.
So I just want to make sure I'm getting you right. You're saying that the mistake we made after the Cold War was cutting too deeply, not because you do get the criticism from the other side that says we maintained defense spending too high, that we were too locked into a Cold War search for a threat mindset. And Colin Powell, the sainted Powell, who just died recently, designed the base force to head off deeper cuts.
Well, I mean, I just think it's more complicated. We cut the procurement budgets. We definitely did that. We then ramped up because Congress pushed back. but we didn't have a strategy. We didn't envision a multipolar world where we could compete, but also coexist with other countries that had maybe different economic and political models than we have. We didn't assume China would want a different economic or political model. Why would they want that? We admitted them to the WTO, and we assumed they wanted to be us. Well, oops. And we really didn't get it after the first World Trade Center bombing, that these guys were trying to come after us in our country. We didn't get it, and we didn't prepare for it, I don't think. And we were surprised by it, and then we overreacted. I'm sure that's coming soon. The next question.
Well, not yet. I'm still going to try to defend the establishment, and particularly the Clinton administration in which I served. So we got something. Did we get anything right? I guess, let me put it that way. What about Nunn-Lugar? What about dealing with loose nukes in the Soviet Union?
Yeah, that was a great success, actually.
Okay.
I
Phew, I knew I could find one.
I said
thing
it was
we did right.
nuanced, and I was serving then too. I was in Congress, and I was on the Armed Services and Science Committees first, and then finally got on Intel, and was on Intel and Armed Services, and then was on Intel and Homeland Security. So I kind of transitioned. Homeland Security Committee was set up after 9/11. But yeah, we did get that right. Nunn-Lugar, I assume you're all smart. You all know what that is. And by the way, Nunn is a Democrat. He's still living, and Lugar was a Republican. And those were the halcyon days where bipartisan coalitions. Lee Hamilton was another person who was kind of in that loop, working with Lugar at one point. And in fact, the public policy school at Indiana is named after them together. But those were the good old days when people wanted to solve problems rather than just bash each other.
So, okay, so Nunn-Lugar was a success. What about managing the conflict in the Balkans and achieving the Dayton Peace Accords and stuff like that?
We came late to that, I think, and so did Europe. And Richard Holbrooke, again, a really amazing guy who rubbed a lot of people the wrong way. Very difficult man, but also totally brilliant. Was just an extraordinary life force at Dayton, and hammered out an agreement that I would call good enough. At least there's no more ethnic cleansing. But on the other hand, if you go there, there's a tripartite government that can get nothing done. It sort of resembles ours these days, but it seriously was constructed in a way where it's checkmate all around. And so that area has made very little progress, or that would certainly be my observation about that. But that was a brutal regional war, I guess you'd call it that. And things like Srebrenica were just horrifying examples of human depravity. And I remember going to Sarajevo, which had been the location of one of our Olympics just fairly recently before that, and seeing the Olympic Stadium, which was all shot up, and a temporary graveyard for all the people who died. And you just realize how quickly things can unravel, which is a lesson for these times when we think about some problems that you're going to ask me about.
So where I was teeing you up to say something which I don't know if you believe, but is it that you can solve problems A, B, and C, but if D smacks you in the head, then you don't get as much credit for A, B, and C?
Totally right. Totally right. But that again is the argument for a strategy. If you're just tactical, which I think we've essentially been for 30 years, 4 presidents, and now we're on President 5, who is trying hard to develop not just to talk about, but to develop a foreign policy strategy. Not fully developed yet, I would argue. But anyway, he's trying hard to do it. If you just do tactics, that's exactly what happens to you. A, B, and C might be successes, but if D is a failure, D is the latest tactic, and you get nailed by that.
Okay, so you talked about how you and several other commissions anticipated that terrorism was going to be a larger problem in the future than the Clinton administration was giving it attention. But of course, they did have terrorist attacks on their watch that they knew about, right? The bombings, the embassy bombings. They did, Dick Clark knew about bin Laden, was concerned about bin Laden. Was it a lack of strategy, or was it a lack of willpower to use, put at risk American lives on behalf of, chasing small units around the world when the threat to the United States seemed remote?
Well, again, I think if we had been more strategic about the fact that after the Cold War, we were not going to be the sole superpower and the world was going to get complicated, but in different and new ways, we could have seen this coming. I mean, it wasn't that hard to see it coming as a member of this National Commission on Terrorism, bipartisan commission. Jerry Bremer, by the way, was the chairman and did an excellent job. Jerry Bremer, L. Paul Bremer, later became our viceroy in Iraq.
Right.
And unfortunately was blamed for a lot of the bad decisions that had to do with Iraq. The first one was one that I participated in, which was voting for the war in Iraq. And we can go into that if you want to.
I want to get to that time period. So 9/11 happens, and you could argue that we should have anticipated it. Many people said we should have anticipated it. Many people said it was a failure of the intelligence community more broadly. And this begins one of your more signal legislative accomplishments, which was a reform of the intelligence community. So I was expecting more crowing about that in the book. And well, no, you do claim credit, but you talk about
shared credit.
How shared credit, but I mean, but you also talk about how little progress there's been made across the board. That's where I'm.
Oh, okay. Well,
so
all right.
Talk about intelligence reform, what you tried to do, and what grade you'd give that effort now 20 years on.
Okay. Well, just back up a little bit. The organization for our intelligence community dates from 1947, when the National Security Act was passed after World War II. And it set up the CIA, which had before that been the Office of Strategic Services, OSS, and it set up a management system run by the CIA, and the modern structure of our Defense Department, and so on and so forth. And what my little soundbite, I think it's in the book, is that no business in America could operate under a 1947 business model. We didn't update it. We did not, except in some, we tinkered with it, but we didn't update it. And 9/11 and then Iraq WMD were two massive intelligence failures. Peter, you're right. And they had to do with bad statecraft, bad analysis, and bad coordination. I mean, the CIA and the FBI didn't talk to each other. The FBI didn't talk to itself. And we had pre-knowledge that some bad guys were meeting in Malaysia and coming to the US, and oops, they came. And then we had pre-knowledge too that some of them were going down to San Diego to stay with an FBI informant, get that. We knew that a few of them were taking flight lessons, but not learning to take off and land. And they were just pieces of this puzzle. Obviously, hindsight is always better. But there were pieces of this puzzle we should have solved. And the same thing on Iraq WMD, where we really got it wrong. And I read the intelligence materials pretty carefully to the extent I could get hold of them then as a member of the senior Democrat on the Intelligence Committee. And our argument was that Saddam Hussein had weapons of mass destruction. He had chemical weapons, which are a form of WMD, and he intended to use them on us. And I remember at the time when, this is in the book too, because you knew my late husband, Sidney Harman. I remember having read everything, traveled everywhere. I came home one night for dinner and I said, Sidney, I'm going to vote for the Iraq War resolution. And he said, you're going to do what? And I said, I read everything, traveled everywhere, and I believe Saddam Hussein is trying to harm us and we need to do this. And he said in his indelible way, that's a lot of crap. And I said, look, you're a business mogul and you know a lot about that. You don't know anything about this. To which he responded, you'll see. And he turned out to be right. And a lot of people, including Brent Scowcroft, whom some of you have heard of, and Peter and I knew well as the co-chair of the Aspen Strategy Group, who was, everyone thinks, the best national security advisor in the history of the world, thought the war was a bad idea and said so. Brent said it publicly in an op-ed in the Washington Post, for which he was pilloried by all of his friends in government then in the Bush administration, including Condi Rice, who had been his mentee. And it was a very painful moment for him, but he was right and I was wrong. And so
You left the story unfinished though in the book. What did Sidney ever say, I told you so?
of course he did.
Yeah.
Well, why wouldn't he say that? But then you asked me about intelligence reform. So obviously we had to fix the 47 business model. We came up with a structure that is being used in the Pentagon, which is a joint command structure over the different military services. And we decided to have a joint commander over the different intelligence services. And we called that person the Director of National Intelligence. And it was a big fight, hard slog, it's in the book, to get the law passed over the strong objections of then Vice President Dick Cheney and then Secretary of Defense Donald Rumsfeld and the then Chairman of the House Armed Services Committee. But George Bush, 43, came out in favor of it, and we had a lot of other support, and we got it passed. And how do I grade it? I think it's the right concept. It's had its, it's 50% law and 50% leadership. And the DNI leadership has been uneven over the years because presidents have valued it in different ways. And the last president basically tried to clean house at the top and install, political people, which was very damaging in my view. And now we have much better leadership. And so I still think the concept is valid, and I still think our intelligence products are better, and it was a net benefit to the country to do this.
And this might be unfair to Avril, but even with a serious professional in the office, they got the Afghan withdrawal wrong, and they admitted that they didn't predict it.
But they said, they didn't predict that the country would fall in 5 minutes. They didn't predict that, but they were issuing warnings for a long time. One of my closest friends, who happens to be a senator, who said that the briefings were, and this person is on Senate Intel, that the briefings were pretty terrifying for a long time, and that the claim of this person, this anonymous person, is that the Biden administration wasn't listening closely enough to what was said. When you, again, hindsight's better, but when you look back on it, if you set a hard date for withdrawal, you've got a number of troops in Afghanistan who at the time were basically unpaid. The country was a kleptocracy. It truly was something that we unfortunately helped enable. We can talk about that. But at any rate, what are you supposed to think if you're an unpaid soldier in Afghanistan and the air cover and a lot of the support and training of your military is going to go out the door in a few months? You're going to think this is unwinnable, and I'm also starving, and so maybe I'll make a deal with the Taliban so that they won't kill me. And I think we kind of knew that, but we didn't process it the way we should have. And we should have, if that was going to be the decision. And I say in this book that I think we overstayed in Afghanistan, and it was mission creep. And once the mission authorized by Congress was accomplished, we should have started an orderly withdrawal, as we did in 1991 in the first Iraq War, where Colin Powell was in charge.
So I wonder, though, if I've been unfair by focusing on major intelligence failures like the 9/11, WMD, maybe the Afghan collapse, but that there's a string of intel successes that people like you would know about because you're in the Gang of Eight, you get read into these, but you can't brag about the intelligence successes. You only have to apologize publicly for the intelligence failures. So based on what you've seen on the inside, would you say that their overall record is a lot better than the impression one would get?
Definitely, I would say that. Right, you can't brag about things that are classified. You also can't brag about things that didn't happen. And let's understand, we haven't had another major attack on US soil yet since 9/11. And the mindset, this is important too. After 9/11, the mindset of all of us, I mean, most of you are too young to really process this, or were at the time, it wasn't those darn Republicans weren't paying attention, or those horrible Democrats weren't paying attention. It was America is under attack, and we, America, need to find the ways to protect our country. And on 9/11, late in the day, when the Capitol was finally reopened, I was horrified that we closed the Capitol when members of Congress take an oath to protect the national. I forget what. Yeah, well, the Constitution says the oath is to protect I don't know if it says the national defense, provide for the national defense, the common defense. Okay. Anyway, we take an oath to do that, and we close the major symbol of America. We did it because there was information it might be, and I think it would have been the target of that last plane, which went down in Pennsylvania because of the heroism of its passengers. And by the way, that plane took off late. If it had taken off on time, we might have been unaware of that, and the Capitol really could have been the target. But at any rate, we reopened the Capitol. We stood on the Capitol steps, 150 at least members of Congress at the time. I was one of them. We held hands and we sang. What did we sing? God Bless America. And the point was, we stood there together. I didn't think about, was there a Republican next to me, or who is this person? Do I like him or not? Didn't matter. We were all members of Congress, sworn to protect the defense of our country, and standing together to do that. And that's a moment that we haven't seen since.
Well, that tees up nicely my next question, because in that same spirit, in that same moment, Congress passed the Patriot Act. And of course, later that was criticized. A number of folks said that that went too far. But doesn't that reflect a bipartisan consensus in the moment for a strategy, at least a way to take the gloves off, or to lean in the other direction if we've been leaning too far in this direction?
Yeah, I voted for the Patriot Act. It was changed some. I think the Bush administration asked for a lot of tougher provisions, and some of the provisions in it were later modified. The so-called library provision was very controversial. Its intent, which was the modification later. In fact, I worked with Bernie Sanders. I still can't believe that happened, but I worked with Bernie Sanders on this. I'm saying that because at least when he was a member of Congress, he didn't easily work with people who didn't share all of his beliefs. But we worked to modify it so that all it pertained to was if you're using a computer in a library, and under certain circumstances, the government has some tools to find out what you're doing. And, you know, surprise, surprise, computers and the web are the way a lot of the terrorists communicate. But it was so broadly drafted that it could have meant, and people were, I think, rightly offended. It could have meant that what books you take out in the library are subject to, the government knowing about them. And that was not the intention. So we narrowed the Patriot Act later, but there was bipartisan support for a series of laws, including the authorization to use military force in Afghanistan. And what was authorized was degrading those who went after us on 9/11. We didn't authorize staying permanently in Afghanistan as an occupying force, nor did we authorize 40 military missions in 19 other countries, many of them having nothing to do with the people who came after us. So I'm just saying there was support for a series of initiatives. Not all were perfect, that's for sure, but that were right. And if the Bush administration had come to Congress, which it didn't come to Congress, and said, we need some new rules for interrogations and detentions, help us draft those, We need some place to incarcerate these enemy combatants. We didn't call them prisoners, and they
POWs. We didn't call them
we didn't, no, we didn't call them POWs. They weren't wearing uniforms. This was a completely different circumstance. We need some new rules and new location to incarcerate these people. I think there would have been bipartisan support and better ideas than Guantanamo Bay Prison, or if you've been reading the papers lately, a black site in Poland where one of these detainees who was finally able to testify described horrific, in my view, assuming that's accurate, no one has said it isn't, horrific and unnecessary treatment by, it sounds like, the CIA.
It's my understanding, and I may be wrong, correct me if I am, that the Bush administration had to brief the Gang of Eight on some of these things, even if they didn't go to Congress, the full Congress for legislation, but on interrogations and things. Did they have to brief you all on what they were doing?
Okay, well, this is in the book. We knew about black sites. Black sites are undisclosed prisons in other countries. I kept asking, where are they? They wouldn't tell me. They never told me. I was briefed, and this is in the book. I couldn't have told you when I was briefed because it was classified then, on the list of procedures that we used against prisoners. Now, the allegation of this enemy combatant the other day was what we did exceeded those, but basically the procedures we used were the things we train our own military against. They're called SEER techniques. Waterboarding is among them. So I was briefed by the CIA General Counsel as a member of the Gang of Eight on what these things were, and sat in a room. My eyes were bigger than my body, and wrote a letter immediately after that to him. And the letter said, thank you for the briefing. I would like to know what policy guidance there has been for the use and adoption of these techniques. And P.S., he had told me that we had videotaped a lot of this. P.S., do not destroy the videotapes. I got back a while later, a classified answer, which said, basically, thank you for your letter, we'll get back to you. That was it. That was all I got. And what I learned later was, what we all learned later. And so Congress was not treated as it, historically had been treated, and hopefully will be treated again as, a separate branch of government entitled to oversee the activities of the executive branch. And yes, this was all classified. I respected that. And the reason I'm talking about it now is my letter was declassified later, and there was a more public conversation.
So around the same time, another one of your landmark pieces of legislation, which another Dookie, David Schanzer, helped you on, is the setting up of the Homeland Security edifice, which was perhaps even a heavier lift than Intel reform. You had less focused opposition, but you had a larger number of cats to herd to get them into the stable. So in hindsight, do you think you all got the Homeland Security reforms and I'm thinking now at the institutional level, what you created, did you get that right?
Not so much. Here's the backstory.
Blame David Schanzer for that.
No.
Okay, good.
No. Why would I blame anybody from Duke? Remind me to tell you my David Rubenstein stories, speaking of Duke. The way that came down, and that is in the book, and we all learned this later, was that a hearty little band of bipartisan members, the senators and members of Congress, and I was in it, thought we should institutionalize by law the Homeland Security czar who existed in the White House. And because we thought someone in the White House needs to coordinate our homeland activities and make sure that there is some connection between our homeland focus and our international focus, consistent with what else we were doing. And so we wanted to make that into some form of law. Meanwhile, the administration, unbeknownst to us, was drafting this large proposal. And I don't think it was a coincidence, but on the day that the papers were about to release the fact that Colleen Rowley, who was an FBI agent in Minneapolis, had written a note to FBI Central that there were people in, I think it was in Minneapolis, who were going to training sites for flying training sites and didn't want to learn how to take off and land, only to fly planes. She thought this was highly weird, and she had warned the FBI, and her memo was about to leak on that day. All of a sudden, there was a proposal from the White House for a new Homeland Security Department. Coincidence. It kind of knocked the Rowley thing off the front page. And that proposal, we all thought, we gasped when we saw how big it was. 22 departments and agencies in under one flag. And but we huddled and we decided, if the White House is for this, we want a Homeland Security function, better go with the momentum and take what they're for. And that's how that got started. And did I think it was kind of big? Yeah. And there are some functions still that are kind of awkward in there. But the other piece that's a disaster is congressional oversight of it. Congress set up Homeland committees in both houses, but in case you missed it, the committee structure in Congress is 17th century or 18th century committee structure. There's a whole agriculture committee, not to knock agriculture, but it's not one of the central things that the US focuses on anymore. There's no tech committee. And so people who stay in Congress a while and become chairs of committees don't want to give up any jurisdiction. So the Homeland committees still don't have enough jurisdiction to do their job. And one of the largest unenacted recommendation of the 9/11 Commission, which came after 9/11, was that Congress should reorganize, which it hasn't done. So we have a huge committee and a very dysfunctional congressional oversight system. And I just recently asked Ali Mayorkas, who's the current Secretary of Homeland, how are you liking your reporting to Congress? And he said, we spend so much time reporting to basically about, it's 88 places, but he said he testified before some number of committees, and no other cabinet secretary has to do that. And it takes enormous time away from really critical functions that his department is involved in, such as the southern border.
So what you're saying is we've had a lot of reform by Congress and no reform of Congress. And the chance for that was in the weeks and months after 9/11, perhaps. But is there any prospect for reform of Congress along the lines that you're suggesting, rationalizing the oversight process?
I'd say slim to none. But also the other committees need reform too. They're not aligned properly against, if you talk about the national security focus, current and future threats. I have said, I have a lot of respect for the people who serve on the Armed Services Committee, but I used to tease, and it's in the book too, that it's in the widget protection business. If you represent a district like I did, and you want to save aerospace jobs, you focus on that. Not that you shouldn't represent your district, but you don't focus on, do we have the right size defense budget against current and future threats rather than legacy systems. If one of those is built in your district, I would guess that most members wouldn't say, oh, well, let's get rid of that. Unless there was a clear strategy to keep people employed in a different line of work.
Okay, so I'm going to ask my last question, and if you want to ask a question, there's a mic there and a mic there. So I encourage you to get in line while I'm asking my question. So you're a cheerful person in day-to-day life, but it's a remarkably bleak critique that you offer in the book. But I want to suggest that you're actually even more negative than you indicate in the book, because you were describing mistakes made at a time when there was effort to cooperate across the aisle. That when there was, as flawed as the Bush administration approach was. There were prospects for cooperation with moderate Democrats. I remember sneaking you into the White House. We'd sneak you in the back door so that folks you wouldn't be compromised for seeing to talk to Bush people. But that level, that was a time that looks almost quaint compared to our contemporary polarization. So that's really what I want you to talk about. That could there be Jane Harmans in today's Congress?
No, I'm in a museum. I'm a dinosaur, remember?
But do you see in the next generation of members, do you see people who share a desire to cooperate across the aisles, or is it all political partisan warfare all the way down? It just never stops.
So, when there was bipartisanship, I know most people can't remember when there was bipartisanship. Before now, certainly before COVID, but before now, we still didn't solve these problems. I mean, there are other reasons why we didn't solve the problems. I say it was hubris, intellectual laziness, and some sense, for better or worse, that America was, as I said, the sole superpower. Why did we have to do the heavy lift on problems that weren't going to matter so much? And we didn't do it. And in the 90s, there was partisanship. And if anybody, I hope you've read about Newt Gingrich, who was elected in
or the impeachment.
or the impeachment, yeah. But Gingrich, who had been a very noisy backbencher in Congress, ran a brilliant campaign to become Speaker in 1994. And for the first time in 40 years, the Democrats lost the majority, and there was Newt. And Newt had the contract with America that he proposed, a sort of 8-part thing, which was very divisive. We don't have to go into all that, but Congress met all day and all night arguing about the contract with America, which some called the contract on America. But, it was a strange period. But there was still bipartisanship, certainly in to the extent there was a focus on foreign policy. Nunn-Lugar's an example, and people were rewarded for that. Over time, what has happened, and it's a longer subject, but is that Congress has become much more of a re-election machine because the margins are so close that the majority is determined by the next election. And this is true next year in 2022. And oh, by the way, tomorrow in Virginia is a big deal. Big, as Trump would say, huge deal. And he's calling in tonight, apparently, to Glenn Youngkin's campaign. And the issue is he going to say something that drives Republicans away, or that pulls Republicans and independents in to vote for Youngkin? And it's, it'll be fascinating to watch this thing. But I think it depends on turnout. And I think that if Youngkin is elected, that will play, whether it's fair or not, as a referendum on Biden's leadership, and really send some more Democrats heading for the exits. I mean, I think this is a really serious moment. But the business model now is blame the other side for not solving the problem, because if you work with the other side, you are bipartisan. And bipartisan is the dirtiest word in politics. And it means that probably that someone to the right of you or the left of you, depending on what party you're in, will run against you in a primary. And the primaries decide most elections. We can talk about that too, but anyway, they do. And so people avoid working across the aisle. And it's a tragedy, a huge loss for our country, and a huge, it seems to me, anyway, it seriously impacts negatively our national security. Okay, so we've got a question here and then here. And state your name so she knows who you are.
Yeah, sure. Hi, Congresswoman Harman. My name is Noah Lanier. It's a pleasure for you to be here. You mentioned earlier about stories about David Rubenstein, and I was just wondering if you could.
I have the best stories. Are you ready? It's Rubenstein, by the way, folks.
Okay,
and I know his name's all over the place, and he went here. So in the early 70s, 400 years ago, I was a young lawyer and I was counsel to the Senate Judiciary Subcommittee on Constitutional Rights. A few of you heard this at lunch. I'm sorry to repeat it. There was a guy who was counsel to the Senate Judiciary Subcommittee on Constitutional Amendments. We had two different, don't ask why, but that guy's name was then David Rubenstein. I don't know exactly when it changed, but anyway, he came from modest roots. His father was a mail carrier in Baltimore, and his mother, I think, was a homemaker. And he and I had the coolest jobs. And David Rubenstein, this is well known, had no money, and he ate a lot of his meals in vending machines. I mean, he wasn't starving, but the pay back in the day, I remember it was $12,500, which went farther than it would today. But anyway, that's what we made, and we were friends. And we both had very good jobs. And then next move, we both ended up in the Carter White House. And he was the deputy to a guy named Stu Eisenstadt, who was the domestic policy advisor. And I was the deputy to a guy named Jack Watson, who was the director of governmental relations and the secretary to the cabinet. And so I was a deputy of those things. And we had offices across the hall from each other. And David still had no money. And then we left the Carter White House and we both went into law practice, which neither of us liked. And then David left law practice and started the Carlisle group, and I didn't. And the moral of the story is that David Rubenstein has a lot of money, which he has shared with his alma mater, and is a very good guy.
Yes. And he's a political science major. That was his undergraduate major. I like to point that out.
Well, that was mine too.
Yeah.
But
So there's future in it.
Thank you again for coming to speak today. My name is Peter Connolly, and you spoke a lot about intelligence reform, especially after 9/11. I was wondering if you think there's intelligence reform now that's needed to counter the domestic terrorism threat, which is different than the terrorism threats we saw after 9/11, and then also adapting the intelligence community to kind of the great power conflict. And do you think there's kind of reform that's needed 20 years after 9/11 further kind of modernize it?
Yes, I'm not sure Congress has to do it, but the CIA is under very good leadership. Bill Burns is probably our most respected diplomat. And
Duke parent of a Duke alum. So we're everywhere. We're the deep state everywhere. Okay.
I don't know what to make of that, Peter. But okay, Duke Parent is the CIA director. And did Avril Haines go here? She didn't go here?
No, but she's spoken here, so yeah.
Oh, she's spoken here. First woman DNI, yay. And so we have very competent folks who get it that the threat matrix is changing. And for example, it's been publicly announced, which is how I know it, because I don't get classified briefings these days, that the CIA is setting up a separate focus on China. I think that's an excellent idea. And everyone gets it, that terrorism is both foreign and domestic, and that they may or may not be related. Sometimes they are, and sometimes they're not. And I think that not just, well, the CIA focuses much more on foreign threats, but our government is now geared to try to understand domestic threats as well. And they didn't start with the Trump administration. They predated that. And we've had, a number of domestic attacks in the past, and they're not all from Muslim countries, in spite of claims by another president and so forth. And so I do think our IC works a lot better, and I think we have very strong leadership right now. And we did have a failure. I mean, Peter's not wrong in terms of anticipating how fast Afghanistan would collapse. But I think they were ahead of, frankly, I think they were ahead of the White House. I think the White House could have listened more carefully, which is what that unnamed senator I mentioned suggested.
Hi, Congresswoman. Thank you so much again for being here. We all really appreciate it. I'm Eleanor Ross, and my question is about your opinion of the new Bureau of Cyber and Digital Policy that's being created under the Biden administration, and how you think it is adapting, and if it's a good step forward to adapting to this new climate and like making changes.
I think it's a big deal. Congress also mandated in the Defense Authorization Act, I guess last year, I imagine, the creation of a cyber czar in the White House. And his name is Chris Inglis, and he's excellent. And there is some competition between the Bureau and him, which is not good. He needs more funding and support, according to what I hear. But cyber can be a weapon of mass destruction too. And we really have to understand it and where it comes from. And I think my sense is, I could be wrong, and Peter will correct me, but that one of the biggest successes that Biden has had was that meeting with Vladimir Putin in June, where according to the press, he issued a warning: you better call off some of this stuff, or we will respond in very strong terms. And it seems like the major cyber attacks from Russia are receding, at least for now. Ransomware attacks are continuing, and a lot of the ransomware attacks originate in the country of Russia. Of course, Putin hasn't done anything about that, so that's annoying. I mean, it's more than annoying, it's serious. But I think we don't understand cyber at our peril, and I think a lot of members of Congress are, like me, digital adapters, and I have a hard time, even though I do focus on it, and my children and grandchildren tease me mercilessly. I have a hard time navigating, beyond a certain level, the digital world. And so we need policymakers who can do this easily. And fortunately, a lot of the staffers, well trained by the Wilson Center, are good at this, and we're hoping it'll trickle up. But I think there still are members who use flip phones. I mean, I know this, you've probably never heard of this flip thing called a flip phone, but I mean, really?
The Congressional Oversight hearing where they had Dorsey and Zuckerberg and blanket on who was the third one, someone from Google, I guess. And the members' questions were, it's almost like a Saturday Night Live skit.
Totally lame. I mean,
Yeah.
Again, another piece of deathless prose for me is that our problems are digital and our politicians are analog. And that's very scary.
So I'm a little more skeptical about whether Putin's on side, yet I want to see some arrests of folks, because of course he knows where they are, he has access to them, and so I don't know that I would declare that a stunning success of the Biden administration, but
I don't think I used the word stunning.
No, but it might be on the positive side of the ledger.
Yeah.
Which we've got more questions, but I'm going to have to piggyback on this because you've praised, I think, every member of the Biden administration so far, and yet the administration seems to be struggling. So these are people who well, you respect them over time.
You know them too.
I do, and I consider many of them friends, but I would also consider that they're struggling right now. Is that fair, and why?
It is fair. It is fair. I think that the policy outlines are good, but the implementation is lagging. And why is that? I don't think it's a cookie cutter answer. I mean, there are different answers. For example, on this Australia submarine deal, at least we say that the Australians were supposed to tell the Brits, to tell the French, and they didn't, or they lied to the French, or that's what the French were claiming. And we thought it had been handled. Well, Biden over the weekend said to Macron that he thinks what we did was clumsy. And I agree with that. It was clumsy. And his appeal to voters was, I think, threefold. Number one, he wasn't Trump. Number two, he was a really nice guy, which he is. And number three, he was extremely competent. And when you see the Australia deal, or you see the way Afghanistan ended, you ask questions about, couldn't we have done this a little differently? And so I agree with that. I mean, how could I not agree with that?
So do you blame the
So
president?
who do I blame?
Yes, that's where I was
Right.
going.
Do we have to blame somebody? I think there's a learning curve, including by him. I mean, he was a vice president for 8 years, but he wasn't sitting on, at the big desk in the Oval Office. And I don't think, in my book, I talk about Obama as indecisive in certain ways. And Biden has been more decisive. I mean, Biden thought, you don't have to agree, but I agree, that we overstayed in Afghanistan and we needed to end the war. And when he started hearing the same old from the same people, he, I think, got impatient and said, no, we're out. And yet, by setting a hard deadline and by doing it the way he did it, I think, I don't want to say blame, I think he helped cause, or he certainly didn't help stop some of the chaos that resulted.
Okay, Ruthie.
Hi, Congresswoman Harman. Thank you for being here. This has been like incredibly enlightening. My name is Ruthie, and something that I was wondering about, Professor Feaver actually lectures us a lot about this, and you spoke about it too, is like in this age of political polarization, diplomatic goals are constantly shifting. I really appreciated your analogy about tactics versus strategy, and I was sort of wondering, how would you recommend the Biden administration craft, or at least begin the process of crafting, a national security strategy that's sort of malleable to this shifting foreign policy goals that comes with changing administrations?
Well, that's a good question, and I think they are trying that. I think saying that foreign policy is about terrorism, but it's also about China, it's also about climate, and it's also about pandemics, is an attempt to create a more flexible framework. It also pulls in the things that have been very serious threats and are very serious threats now. So obviously that's not enough of a foreign policy strategy, but I think what I said before is I think they're really trying to do that. They're struggling with implementation. And the other problem with implementation, Peter, is Congress. I mean, Congress is just at this point almost incapable of doing anything. And there are some very good ideas in Congress, very good people in Congress, but remember, if you work on a bipartisan basis, you not only threaten your own chances of getting reelected, but you threaten your party's chances of either holding or getting the majority. And that's just a very steep hill, and it's really tragic that we've come to this point.
Thank you.
Rithika?
Hi, thank you so much for being here, Congresswoman. Oh, I'm a little short. I wanted to.
I feel your pain.
It's tough. It's tough. I wanted to return to a discussion that we were having sort of at the beginning of the event about whether or not the U.S. had a strategy or a grand strategy in the 90s following the Cold War. I'm not fully convinced that we didn't have a strategy, and so
well, good. You got to help Peter out here.
I was wondering if you could expand a little bit more on your thoughts on why it was that we didn't have a strategy, and whether you think that if you could make the argument that we did, was it that we had the wrong strategy, or that we just failed to implement it the right way?
Well, again, I think we have a slight disagreement among friends. I think that when the Cold War ended, we won. Remember The End of History by Francis Fukuyama? We won. End of story. And we were going to build the world that we wanted, and everyone was going to line up and follow. And that was a complete misconception, or a lazy, idea based on hubris, and we paid a huge price for it. Peter would argue this is how we started. That no, our strategy was to prevent this from ever happening again. And I would agree that we did some things to build a safer world, like removing a lot of the Soviet nuclear arsenal through Nunn-Lugar. That was, yay us, that was a good thing we did. Or actually Congress did it, imagine, Congress did it. And so I think those were good things. But my book is based on the assumption that for a variety of reasons, none of which is good, we didn't think we needed a strategy.
President Clinton would agree with you. In his memoirs, he has that quote where he says, yeah, I didn't think we had a grand strategy either. I disagree with him, but
well, good. I'm glad you disagree.
Yes.
And also we focused in the 90s mostly on a domestic agenda. I mean, Clinton had an agenda which turned out to lose the Democrats the majority, but it was, certainly part of it was raising taxes and increasing a focus on some domestic priorities, plus banning assault weapons.
Right.
And those things enabled Newt Gingrich to get the majority.
Cam and then Kyle.
Hi again, Congresswoman. So earlier in the small group, we talked about, you said like the foremost national security problem now is internal disunity in the country. And maybe a couple of years ago, we had General Stanley McChrystal come here, and he was talking about this problem, and he talked about setting up a mandatory national service program as a potential counter to this. I'm wondering if you've thought about that or what your take on that idea is.
I strongly support that. That idea predates McChrystal, but he's been the guy to kind of bring a focus to it, and the Aspen Institute focuses on it too. And he doesn't mean a mandatory military commitment, but national services, teaching, he has a whole series of things that one could do. I just watch what is happening in Israel, where there is mandatory military service, and what happens after high school is everybody's mixed up with everybody. And later in life, as they go into other careers, many of them, some stay in the military, it turns out that the head of, some tech startup is now supervising somebody who was her supervisor in the military. And, yes, Israel is a much smaller country, but I think the fact that we don't teach civics in school anymore, and we don't have any way to really encourage a broad definition of patriotism in this country is hurting us. And I mentioned that at lunch or after lunch, we don't only have toxic partisanship, we have toxic tribalism here within each party. And it's enormously destructive. And people have no respect for government as currently, or very little respect for government as currently structured in either party. Democrats have much grander ideas about building new government structures, and Republicans want to unravel what we have. And I don't think either direction by itself is the best answer.
I don't know that Israeli politics is much to
Well, there's that.
imitate either, but
I would agree, but I think, it's fair. Fair. Okay, that's one for you, Peter.
Okay, that was keeping score. I hope someone's keeping score. Just on the national service, Senator Hawley made news today. I don't know if you saw it, but he said he wants to remove women from the requirement of registering for the draft on the argument that women should not be required to serve. I'm just curious your view on that.
I think that's a boneheaded idea. And I think that women should, in appropriate ways, if qualified, and men, should be able to participate in any of the positions in the military.
His point was volunteer is okay, required service, drafting is wrong.
If we don't have, we don't draft people now, but we have a mandatory sign-up, as I
Yes.
understand it. But I disagree with him.
Thank you again so much, Congresswoman, for being here. My name is Kyle Malati. I'm one of the co-chairs of the program in AGS. So I'd love to get your opinion about the next couple of elections that are happening, just because like you, I'm probably pretty concerned about the future of Congress. So the first question I have for you is, what do you think will happen in the midterms next year as far as Democrat versus Republican control? And then the second is, who would you like to see run for president of the United States in 2024, assuming Biden doesn't?
So as I mentioned, I think what happens in Virginia tomorrow is really huge. And let's see, it just creates momentum in one direction or another. In political time, the November 2022 election is about 10 years off. I mean, things happen and can change election results even in the last week or so. So it's hard to predict. But given how close the parties are in numbers and the Senate is dead even, it could go either way. And it really will depend on momentum and whether Biden can accomplish enough to tell the right story to voters and who's running against him, assuming it's Biden. And there's some a few people suggest Biden's too old and it won't be Biden. And if it isn't Biden, will it be Kamala Harris, or will she be challenged, assuming she wants to run, by some other people? And again, I don't know, but I think at the moment Biden said he's running. I believe him, and I think he's trying to do a good job. So let's assume he's running. But who's running against him? If it's Josh Hawley, I don't know that would offer the best.
DeSantis, would he win your approval?
No. But there are some very qualified, interesting Republicans, like who, I think a number of them are governors at the moment, not the governor of Texas or Florida. But let me think of it. The governor of Massachusetts is terrific, Charlie Baker. Yay, Charlie. And the governor of New
Republican
Hampshire,
bastion. Yeah.
Sununu, is good. And it's all the Northeast. I don't know, but I'm just saying there are good governors who happen to be Republicans. And by the way, I think the job of governor at the moment is much better than the job of senator. As a governor, you can actually solve problems. Sadly, as a senator, not so much. But who would be my candidate? Peter Feaver.
Heaven forbid. So I think you all see why I spent a dozen years trying to talk her in to coming, and why I took the desperate measure of hiring Paige so that I could make it happen. But
I don't think that was desperate. Excuse you.
Absolutely
I think you're
not.
just
We're-
extremely lucky.
Indeed. But we are in your debt tonight, but the country, I think, is in your debt and of your colleagues who have served over decades and tried to work across the aisle where you could. And in that spirit, I thank you for coming tonight, and I thank you for your service to the country.